So if you've got some locks, they probably came in clumps like this, and the way to separate the locks out is to grab a clump and find a tip end. And usually the tips of the lock are the ends of the lock that hang off the sheep. The butt end is the end that's actually attached to the sheep, and usually the tip end takes the dye a little bit darker. So if you grab a tip end and follow the lock back to its source, to its butt end, and then hold the clump of wool around the butt end and then just gently pull the tip end off, you can separate a lock out. So we see here is another dark end. That's a tip. I'm going to grab hold of it. I'm going to follow the shaft up to the bulk of locks that I have in my left hand, and I'm going to pull that lock off. So this is how you can actually separate the individual locks from your bulk of wool. Here's another example in just a different dye batch and a different type of fleece. Again, still the tip end tends to take the dye a little bit darker, so you can isolate a tip end, grab it in one hand, in the other hand, grab hold of the bulk of your locks and pull that lock free. Find another tip, follow it up to the base, grab hold of the locks, and pull that end free. So the first thing I usually do if I'm going to work with locks is separate all of my locks out, finding the tip end, following it up, and pulling the lock free. Oh, you can tell it's fall in Vermont based on the colors I've chosen here. I always get really excited to work in the autumnal colors this time of year. Anyway, once you have your pile of wool locks, you can spin them, you can knit them directly from the locks. You can also needle felt them and wet felt them, and I'm going to show you all four processes because you could use any of these in the fiber challenge. So you can knit directly from the locks without even using yarn. Here, this swatch of fabric is just knit using locks, and obviously I'm just grabbing different colored locks, and it makes a very textural, very colorful surface. So the way that you knit just using the locks is think about each stitch being both the end of the previous lock plus the midsection of the new lock that you're adding in. So here I'm at the end of a row, and that last stitch I knit with this blue lock, and I knit it, the midsection is over the needle, and so I have the tip end and the butt end hanging out. So this next stitch, the first stitch on this row, I'm going to wrap the two ends around, the two ends of the previous lock around the needle. I'm going to now loop sort of at the 50-yard line, if you will, of this new lock over the needle, and I'm going to knit those two together. Okay. Now on this next stitch, now I have the two ends of the gold lock to wrap around the needle, and I pull tightly. This isn't quick knitting, but it's very colorful and fun. And now I'm going to pick up the next lock, and I'm going to fold it in half and loop that midline over the needle and knit these two stitches, these two locks rather, together in the next stitch. So each stitch that you are knitting into is also a double stitch, so for instance on this stitch that I'm knitting next, there is the midsection of the new lock, a blue lock, and the two tail sections of the previous lock, which was the green lock. So you're always inserting the needle through two locks. You're taking the tail ends of the previous lock, and if you happen to have a very long lock on the stitch before, you might even still have some tail of that to wrap around the needle. So I'm grabbing this entire amount, unless of course you want to let one of it hang out sort of like fringe, but I'm grabbing the whole amount, I'm wrapping it tightly around the needle. Then I pick up the next color I want to knit with, I fold it in half, loop the 50-yard line, so to speak, over the needle, and knit those two stitches together. Insert my needle through the next two stitches, or two locks, which make one stitch. I'm going to grab the tail end and the butt end of this new lock, as well as any residual from the previous lock, hold them tightly, wrap them around the needle, and add my new lock. And this just creates a very colorful and very textural surface, as you can see here. You can also lightly felt this when you're done if you're feeling a little insecure about the stitches, although they're pretty well tacked in there as long as you pull tightly with each stitch. you're really locking each of these individual locks in place pretty well. And this way, especially if you're mixing colors, you can create a really beautiful, random, colorful fabric, and that also has a lot of texture. And it also looks great if you lightly full it as well when you're done. The most common and widely known use of locks in knitting is in making a thrummed mitten, such as this mitten here. In this actual example, instead of using locks, I used pieces of roving or top that had already been carded, but it's actually more traditional to use the raw locks, so I'm going to demonstrate that here. Okay, so earlier I showed a thrummed mitten, which is probably the most common way people are familiar with knitting with locks. So in the case of a thrummed mitten, you usually lock one lock in every couple of stitches, and what you end up with on the right side of the fabric are these little single stitches, which a lot of Norwegian knitting refers to as lice. On the back side, you end up with both the tip and the butt end of the fiber, which stay to the inside of the mitten, and as you wear it and the friction of your hand and the heat from your body felt these thrums and make a nice warm lining inside your mitten, and on the outside you have these decorative lice. Okay, so to thrum a mitten or any piece of fabric, a hat is nice to thrum as well, you're going to knit over to where you want to place your thrum, and different patterns will tell you different frequencies of placing a thrum. When I do mittens, I usually do the lock or the thrum every third stitch and on every second or third row, depending upon how thick I want the mitten to be. So you knit to the stitch you want to place your thrum, insert the needle as if you're going to knit it, grab your lock, loop it over your index finger at the 50-yard line, loop that lock over the needle, holding the two tails of that lock, both the butt and the tip end in the back. Also wrap the yarn around the needle and pull your loop through. So you're knitting both a stitch of yarn as well as your lock at the same time. But if you insert it in that order, the lock will remain on the surface and the stitch of yarn is actually left behind. Now some people actually don't wrap the yarn at all on a thrum stitch. They simply take the lock, loop it over the needle, and knit just the lock in place. I find, though, that I do like to have the stitch knit along with it. It just adds a little more structure to the fabric and a little more security. Then when I'm coming back, when I come to those lice stitches, I like to knit them through the back loop. So I'll just sort of turn mid-work here and turn around and go back. So here I'm purling back, and because I'm on a purl row, I'm going to purl through the back stitch instead of knit through it. So instead of coming through the front loop like this, just to lock that stitch down a little bit more because it adds twists and makes it a slightly tighter stitch, I'm going to come and purl through the back loop. And of course, if you were knitting a pair of mittens and doing this either on double pointed needles or on a long circular needle, you would be knitting on this row, not purling as I am on this little sample here. So you'd knit through the back loop. In this case, because I'm on a purl row, I'm purling through the back loop. And I do it just on the stitch that has the lock because I feel like it secures it, tightens it down, and traps it in there a little bit better. So here you can see I've placed some thrums in randomly on this sample. The other option you have, instead of just looping the lock over one stitch and letting the thrums hang to the back side, which again, if this was a mitten or hat, would be the inside and would felt down as you wear it, you can also, to create a different sort of streaked appearance, little blips of color, you can knit the entire lock along from tip end to butt.